Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about collecting qualitative data, and we're going to focus on sampling and also talk a bit about access. Okay, this is adapted from chapter 7 of your textbook. So, five process steps in collecting qualitative data. The first thing is to identify the participants and sites. Next, you need to gain access to those individuals and the sites where they're located. You want to identify what types of information will answer your research questions. You want to design protocols or instruments for collecting and recording that information, and then you want to administer the data collection. Usually, you're going to do step 3 and 4 before you do step 1 and 2. Okay. So the way we identify participants and sites is usually through purposeful sampling, although convenient sampling works in a pinch. The studies are usually conducted at whatever the research site is, and instead of this idea that we're going to bring participants into a lab or something like that. Qualitative studies rely on general interviews or observations, usually not someone else's instrument, although you might adapt someone else's research protocol, like for example, their interview protocol for use in your study. Qualitative researchers through record information through self-designed protocols. Again, you might adapt it, but generally you're going to be designing it yourself. Another thing you might be adapting is someone's conceptual framework. Qualitative studies require sensitivity to challenges and ethical issues from gathering face-to-face information, often in homes and workplaces. Because we're doing people to people, right? These are people interacting with other people in qualitative studies. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between quantitative sampling and qualitative sampling. Now, when we talked about quantitative research, one of the things was that bell curve, right? And we're trying to use our sample to make inferences about a population of people would be represented by that curve. And so we want to select individuals who are representative because we want to do this generalizing from the sample to the population. Okay? Qualitative is very different. Okay? We're doing purposeful sampling in order to best understand our phenomenon. In both cases, we want to answer our research questions, but the way we're going about it is very different from a sampling perspective. We want to talk to the people who are going to help us understand our phenomenon. These people may not be representative of some larger population, but they may have experiences, expertise, perspectives that we need to hear about in order to answer our research questions. Okay, we want to develop a detailed understanding so they might have access to useful information. We want to help people learn about a particular phenomenon. Okay, and we also may want to give voice to people who haven't often been heard, who have been silenced in traditional research. So, purposeful sampling, a definition is that we're intentionally selecting individuals and sites to understand a central phenomenon. We're choosing participants and sites that are information rich. Okay, information rich. And we're identifying a sampling strategy based on our intent. So there are a variety of different intents we might have in as part of the design of our study. Okay, so um, let's talk about before the data collection. We might want to be talking about many different perspectives on a particular phenomenon, or maybe we're talking about the nuances of a particular phenomenon. Then we would use maximal variation sampling. We might want to describe particularly troublesome or enlightening cases, okay? And so then we're going to choose cases that are at the extreme of something. Um, um, yes. And that would be an extreme case sampling that just where we're really trying to illustrate a problem by looking at an extreme case, for example. Sometimes we want to describe a typical setting. Um, and this, then we would choose what we would determine is typical. So, for example, if I wanted to describe the working lives of a typical elementary school teacher, I might choose a um, white woman in her late 20s or early 30s, okay, as as a typical uh, uh, person if she's at a at a fairly typical elementary school, right? Okay. Maybe I want to generate a theory or concept, and then I'm going to be looking for critical sampling that's going to allow me to generate that theory. Maybe I want to describe some particular subgroup in depth, and then my sampling is going to be homogeneous because every person that I talk to or observe would be a member of that subgroup. Do I want to describe a case that illustrates dramatically a particular situation? And this is similar to a particularly troubling or enlightening case. Then I'm going to, whatever the situation or concept that I'm trying to study, that's what I'm going to look for. Maybe there's a theory that I'm working from and I'm going to try and find a case that matches with that theory. Now, after data collection has started, you may find that you need to get additional folks, additional participants in your study. So, one way is that as a case unfolds, so a particular situation develops, um, um, let's say we're looking at an elementary school teacher. Well, who is she coming into contact with? Let's say she has a really good conversation with a parent, and you're observing. You may then approach the parent and say, "Hey, can I interview you about your interactions with this teacher?" Um, that's opportunistic sampling. And then snowball sampling often is when we need to locate people or sites to study. We may not know who is really good at doing a particular thing. So we find one or two experts, and they're our first participants in our study, and we ask them, okay, well, who else do you recommend that I talk to? We may also be looking for confirming or disconfirming cases. And so, for example, let's say we're studying first generation college students, right? And we're interviewing these first generation college students, and we're learning about their lives and what led them to be first generation college students, right? To be college students. But we might want to also interview some 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in college and none of whose family members have been in college to understand um, the things that we're finding out from the college students. Okay, let's say they say, "Oh yes, there was someone in my family who said I have to go to college because I really need to be in college in order to pursue XYZ career." And then we're going to talk to someone else and find out what their family members said to them. Okay, so just get a broader view. In order to support the claims that we're making in our research. All right. So let's talk a little bit about each of these types of samplings. The maximal variation sampling, cases that differ or participants that differ on characteristics or traits, whether it's age groups, gender, racial background, or if they're in different locations. Maybe you're going to look at folks that are working in a city school, folks that are working in a suburban school, folks that are working in a rural school, for example. Extreme out case sampling, that outlier case, or the one that has extreme characteristics. So um, um, you're studying, let's say you're studying the school to prison pipeline. So maybe you're going to choose someone who was imprisoned particularly young. Okay, for example. And typical sampling is the opposite, right? In that you're studying the person or site that's typical. You're concerned with what's typical or normal. And you may determine where to go or who to talk to based on some kind of quantitative data. Sometimes you're trying to generate or discover a theory, right? Grounded theory, you'd be doing that. And you'd be selecting sites that would allow you to um, just allow you to illustrate that theory or concept. Homogeneous sampling, um, looking for a subgroup with defined characteristics. So maybe I did a study where I was looking at teachers who were fast tracked into the profession, for example. And so everyone that I was talking to or talking talking to someone else about had followed a fast track route into the profession. Okay, so critical sampling, this rep- are individuals or sites that represent a central phenomenon dramatically. It may be an exceptional case, okay? For example, teenage violence, you may be at a school where they experienced a gun incident, for example, a dramatic example. Opportunistic sampling, you're going to take advantage of unfolding events. The sample emerges through the research, okay? So let's say again let's say you're studying teachers. Maybe you're studying teachers who are new, young teachers, right? New teachers. And one of the teachers is expecting, announces that she is pregnant. Then you have an opportunity to understand the experiences of new teachers who are pregnant. Snowball sampling. This is after the study begins, you may not know the best people, right? Particularly if you're studying something that's not quite your field. Then you ask participants to recommend others. And this is also a strategy you can use when you're new to a particular location. Confirming and disconfirming sampling, very important in grounded theory. Okay, it's in having disconfirming cases or a sense of the variation. It can be important in all kinds of studies, but you really want to this idea that you're testing a theory, okay, like you do with grounded theory, um, requires that you want to find these these confirming and disconfirming cases. Okay, so if department chairs act as mentors, then you want to talk to those who are identified as good mentors, and maybe you want to talk to somebody a department chair who isn't doing any mentoring, or the teachers under that department chair. Okay, you're looking for an in-depth perspective on with qualitative research. And getting an in-depth perspective takes time. Okay? It takes time, it takes energy, not only on your part as the researcher, but on the parts of your participants. So you're going to be focusing on a few individuals, a few cases, particularly in student research, okay? And often in a lot of professional research, if your job title doesn't have researcher in it, okay, if your research is part of your job but not the whole job, then you're really going to be focusing on just a few individuals, just a few cases. Okay, done well, that is all you will need in order, because your goal is to understand your phenomenon. It's not to generalize to everybody, all new teachers everywhere, right? It's to understand a particular phenomenon, right? The experience of pregnancy among new elementary school teachers, for example. You're trying to understand that phenomenon. All right. In some situations where there are multiple researchers working together, they may be working at multiple sites. You might have 30 to 40 participants, but that is rare. And that is almost unheard of when you have student level projects. Also, collecting and analyzing qualitative data takes time. Okay, so for each participant you add to your study, you're adding a lot more time for collecting and analyzing that data. Okay, you need institutional review board approval. Okay, and the institutional review boards were established to protect research participants. We know of some really good examples, really troubling examples, where researchers have behaved unethically and research participants have suffered as a result and in some cases died. Okay, so institutional review boards, very crucial. So we need their permission. We also need permission from gatekeepers at the research site. So these are individuals who provide site access and help the researcher locate people and identify places to study. The gatekeeper may require written information about the project, and it's usually a director or leader, or someone whom that person has delegated the approval um, process to. It helps if your reviewers are familiar, they should say familiar with qualitative inquiry. You're going to develop a detailed description of your procedures, and you're going to decide how you're going to protect anonymity. Also, you're going to discuss the need to respect the site and minimize disruption, okay? Because, our participants need to lead their lives in addition to participating in our study. So we want to respect the site and minimize disruption. We might be describing opportunities to reciprocate. What are our participants going to get out of participating? Okay. Is there something that they're going to get back? And in addition, we'll have detailed descriptions of the procedures, and we may acknowledge that we may adopt participant beliefs. That's not something you have to do. It's kind of more understood, but it's important from an anthropological standpoint. Okay. We might specify power imbalances. So, what exactly is the relationship between the researcher and the researched? Is there a power imbalance that needs to be taken into account in terms of protecting the participants? We detail the time that is going to be required for us to be at the site and provide a list of interview questions. And usually that list is called a protocol. So we provide a protocol for our interview, for our observation, that kind of thing. Gatekeepers, there are certain things we want to tell them. We want to tell them why we chose their site. We want to tell them what's going to be required of them, what time and resources will be required of them or those who work for them. What we hope to accomplish, what potential There is for us to be disruptive and what we're going to do to minimize that potential, and what individuals at the site will gain from the study, if anything. And especially, we want to tell them how we will use and report the results. And we may want to describe in detail how we're going to protect anonymity, okay, if that's one of the things that's needed. It's not always. Some certain field issues. Okay, now, okay. So, one of the things you're going to be negotiating with the gatekeeper is time. Okay. You need sufficient access to the site in order to collect the data. You need sufficient time. Um, Observations require time. Interviews require time. You want to limit your initial collection to one or two observation or interviews, um, because you that's going to give you some beginning information that you may use in order to refine your study. Time is needed to establish a substantial database. Um, uh, yeah, time. It takes time. You may be in an observational role initially. You need to build rapport with the participants. There has to be a certain level of trust before people will be willing to sit down and talk with you honestly. And you need to obtain permission to use documents or audiovisual materials. Certain ethical issues. Okay, first of all, in most education research, in most counseling research, you're not, it's not like investigative journalism where you might be there under false pretenses. No, we don't do that. We inform our participants of our purpose most of the time. Most of the time, we're going to refrain from deceptive practices. There are certain limited situations where deception is necessary, but most of the time, it's not necessary in education. We're going to share our role as a researcher and be respectful of the research site. We're going to think about how we're going to give back. Sometimes, if you're studying a particular topic and at a particular site, whether it's at your own school or at another school, then you might, at the end of your study, do a workshop for the teachers about your topic so that they learn more about your topic. Whether, again, it could be a workshop, it may not involve the data that you collected, but just giving information to the teachers about whatever this thing is that you're interested in. Using ethical interview practices, basically being respectful, and if you say you're going to interview for 60 minutes, interviewing for 60 minutes or 50 or 45 or how just staying within the bounds of a respectful interview. Maintaining confidentiality is very important. And you want to kind of look at your relationship with participants as collaborative to the extent possible. Okay, because there is a power dynamic between the researcher and those who are researched. Okay, so you want to collaboratively generate the stories that we're going to use in our studies, in our research reports. So there are different types of qualitative data that we collect. We may observe, and often that's called participant observation because usually you're in education research and counseling research, typically you don't have a situation where there's like the one-way mirror and you're observing without being there in the room. Usually you're there, and if you're in a classroom, someone's going to come over and ask you to tie a shoelace or ask you if you know the answer to something or that kind of thing. Interviews and questionnaires. Interviews are the most common type of qualitative data collection method, the most common by far. Questionnaires can be thought of as paper and pencil interviews. Okay, open-ended questionnaires are what we use in qualitative research. Documents, we might review documents. Audiovisual materials, whether they're photographs or videos or illustrations or that kind of thing, we might also be analyzing those. So if you think about in the text, there's this mother's trust in principles, that qualitative study. So if you look carefully at their methodology section, okay, and you'll see they're writing a plan on their methodology section is basically the plan on how they're conducting this qualitative case study. They provide a justification for the use of the qualitative case study approach. And they discussed their purposeful sampling and so snowball sampling that they used. You want to look for an awareness of field issues, and you'll notice that they have a small sample. Okay, and they have face-to-face interviews and provided topics of the questions that they included in their interviews. Okay, so that is information about sampling and access in qualitative data collection. Okay, bye bye.